research panel. I'm Rebecca Long, the Associate Dean of the Graduate School, and on our panel today we have Dr. Hart Bailey in Department of Pathobiology, and Population Medicine. We have next to him Dr. Daniel Peterson, Director of the Institute for Genomics, Biocomputing, and Biotechnology. Next to Dr. Peterson is Dr. Moffitt. Dr. Moffitt is from the Department of Philosophy and Religion and specializes in bioethics, amongst other things. And then finally, Dr. David Morse on the end, who's from the Department of Counseling and Education Psychology. Our chair today, or our spokesperson today, is TJ Bradford. TJ is a PhD student in agriculture and is also the president of the Graduate Student Association. TJ has some questions that he's going to throw out to the panel, and we're going to leave it up to you as to whether or not you want to pause after each question and wait for questions from the audience, or do you want to just go through and talk as you will? It's kind of up to you.
Well, since the panelists outnumber the audience members, maybe we should introduce the audience members as well. You'd introduce yourselves.
All right. Would you like to introduce yourself?
My name is Saina Zhu. I'm from the Curriculum Instruction and Special Education Department, and I'm from China. And this is my first semester of my PhD study.
And your first name is Dana again?
And my first name is Dana. Yes.
Dana. Welcome.
Thank you.
Nice to have you here.
My name is Carly Calico, and I'm a first-year PhD student in agriculture. I actually share an office with TJ.
Did TJ make you come?
Well, you know, there's a little persuading going on. But I'm here and excited, so.
And are you a TA also?
I am.
Well, welcome to
Thank you.
And I'm Margaret Mangala, and I'm program coordinator for the graduate office.
Okay. TJ, I'll let you take it away.
Alrighty, so I know that I will learn a lot because coming from plant and soil science, there's a different kind of research that you do in the School of Human Sciences, so I always learn a lot from discussions like this. So for our first question, do you have any personal experience either as a student or a principal investigator when someone in your lab or research group has attempted or committed research misconduct? How was this handled and what was the outcome?
I'll answer the first part first. Yes.
Okay. So how was this handled or what was the outcome? Anybody can take this one.
I'll pass that on.
I had an incident. It wasn't actually, it was a little different, but essentially I had a student that had started working on a PhD in my lab. And after a while, he had come from another school, did his master's degree at another school here in Mississippi, a small school. And after a while, he came to me and he told me, you know, I need to tell you something. And I asked him, you know, we sat down and to talk about it. And essentially, he told me that the work that he did his master's research on was pretty much fabricated by his mentor, the professor at this university, who, by the way, worked with a lot of different people here on campus. And after being in my lab where I had everybody check everything, and, you know, he had come to see that he had been told by this fellow. This student was from India, and his advisor that he had as a master's student was from India. And this advisor had told him, to get by in this country, to succeed, you have to do this. And so he followed along with it. Well, he realized that wasn't the truth, and so he came to talk to me, which brought up some pretty big issues. Of course, my first thing was I went to my department head, and I went to the other scientists that I knew that here at Mississippi State that were actually collaborating with this individual. We got together and we had a meeting to talk about what to do, and ultimately it was brought to the attention of this professor that we were aware of what had happened. He, of course, denied it all. The university that he was at denied anything and tried to blame the student, but the evidence was pretty overwhelming. We had all the physical evidence as well. Ultimately, this gentleman left his position and got another position somewhere else. Our decision at the time was one of, there was no published papers that came out of that research. This fellow was getting lots and lots of money for training students, and he produced a lot of posters, and it was on those posters that the data was fabricated. And so the decision was made at that time by the group not to work with this individual anymore. But we did not, make a big report or anything about it at that time, because the thought was that if this ended up in published literature, we would definitely be opposed to that. The fellow had done legitimate research at one time, but
Why were you opposed to that becoming public?
Why was I opposed to it becoming public? I wouldn't say that I was opposed to it becoming public. My primary concern was for my student, who was kind of being caught between Mississippi State University and this other school. And the other school, I will just say I haven't worked with them since, but the other school were very happy with the money that was coming in for this guy to train minority students, which he wasn't doing. But anyway, it became pretty sticky politically. And so that was the decision that was made at that time.
It's interesting because you can retract journal articles, but I don't know if there's ever a way to retract posters that are inappropriate. So there isn't really a mechanism to do that.
No.
Were there any repercussions for the student?
I'm sorry?
Were there any repercussions for the student?
There weren't any repercussions for the student, primarily because, actually no published papers came out of his work that he did. He was just started telling me about the things that went on in the lab and the posters and other things that they publish. And they literally just stole the molecular linkage map off of one poster for a different species and put it on their poster. Didn't even change the names of the markers. And so you could go through and tell what it was pretty easily. The student went on, got his PhD, and went to Cornell and did a postdoc, and is now employed by Cornell University. Has done very well. I was very proud of this student for coming forward, and I understood that he was, when he first came here, he was under some pretty bad guidance, and he made some poor decisions, undoubtedly. But.
Do you have any other questions?
I
No, I was going to say, we have any other questions besides my question?
I currently know of no philosopher who I worked with or collaborated with who's ever gotten in trouble for research ethics violations. There is one story that always goes around in every graduate program, and it's always about some guy who got kicked out 10 years ago, and all he did was turn in somebody else's published paper as a seminar paper. But of course, that's the worst way to cheat ever, because obviously people know that material quite well, and so it's obviously a fraud. So people know it's harder to cheat in philosophy because their stakes are so low. But there are the occasional plagiarists. But since we don't have data, there's not any data to fabricate.
That's interesting. I can think of several examples, but I'll just touch on one because it cuts across a couple of the questions that I think may come up today. This involved an up-and-coming assistant professor who was gaining a reputation as just a publishing demon. This person was churning out things left, right, and sideways. Well, come to find out that one of the ways that was happening was that students' work would be abrogated by the faculty member and subsequently show up someplace at a conference or in a paper or something like that. And the student might get credit and might not get credit, depending. And the running joke became, for heaven's sakes, don't leave your homework on your desk in the office suite, or Professor X will publish it tomorrow. And the most egregious example I saw of that was a student who had done a capstone paper for a graduate level class for me. It was, you know, an okay study, nothing to, you know, shake the rafters, but competently done, well analyzed, well written up. And then, you know, I thought nothing else of it until that individual came up for promotion a year and a half later. And there, among the accomplishments, the research accomplishments, was a presentation at 2 conferences by exactly the same title. And I thought, well, this sounds familiar. Let me go back. And sure enough, it was exactly the same title. And the person, being very meticulous as someone who had worked on their portfolio, had included copies of the conference papers. And so I sat the copies down with a copy of the paper as submitted in the course a year and a half earlier. Every word except one, exactly the same. Every word. And so in exchange for that one word change, the student became 3rd author of that publication in one conference and 4th author on another conference. And so when I became aware of that, I made a number of folks on campus aware of that as well, and inquired, what is the mechanism at Mississippi State? I hasten to say, this was before the current administration, so all the guilty parties are long gone. And the fact of the matter was, I got a lukewarm or no reception at all, which I found very disconcerting. And in point of fact, I wrote a detailed letter to the person in charge of research ethics at the time, and 6 months later got a reply saying, I think that the mechanisms we have are satisfactory. And that's where it ended. So, you know, fast forward, later on that individual applied for a position at Mississippi State at a higher level, and I was on the committee, and I made it my duty to inform them of that instance, which gave me that momentary sense of self-gratification. So, end of story.
Do you know if the student had ever consented to have their work published?
No. In fact, I called the student after that and talked to her and said, are you comfortable with this arrangement? Did you know of this arrangement? And the student essentially took it as a compliment that her work would be, you know, publicized in some way, not recognizing the fact that her intellectual property had essentially been abrogated. So I was kind of flabbergasted at both ends of that continuum.
Well, I have a question for Dr. Peterson in your situation. How much responsibility would you assume in that situation is on the student? If the student is, you know, young, impressionable, doesn't really know the ins and outs of how things work, how would you, or to any of the panel, how would you address that concern with the student, or how would you go forward with that?
So I think my hearing's not the greatest. So you said kind of how would you address it, and how would you kind of decide how much of the responsibility was the students
Right.
in the issue? Well, this is one of those difficult case-by-case type things. With regard to this, I had quite a bit of physical evidence implicating but the problem really was that what had happened didn't happen at Mississippi State University. It happened before, and it had happened at another school that I didn't have any. What I felt it was very good that the student came to me to discuss this, because he had seen from at least the way that the people in my laboratory were behaving, the way that we went about things, that we held ourselves to a certain level of professionalism and ethics that he hadn't seen before. And he'd come to me and talk to me about his research, and I would tell him, well, that data is really bad, we can't use that, or whatever. So the fact that he came to me was a big part of why he didn't end up with a lot of problems from that. If it had been the other way around, he probably would have been gone. If I had found out that he had been involved in this and he hadn't told me, I would have had a very hard time trusting him at that point.
That was kind of part of my original question.
I don't know. Okay. So for our next question, if statistical outliers occur in a data set, how should they be handled, included or thrown out?
We have no data, so I can tell you that we don't have outliers. What I tell my students when I teach research ethics is that as long as you're transparent about the methodology, it's going to vary based on field and based on circumstance, and that as long as you stick with a particular way of doing it and you're explicit about it, I don't think it's going to be much of a worry. So I don't think there is a general answer to that across all research fields.
I would agree, and I would say there's no one answer to it. Part of it depends on what you're trying to do with the data. If you're trying to build a model that's generalizable to the greater part of a population, not every part of a population, then it makes sense to screen for atypical cases because they tend to be overly influential in the results. And that's a problem in terms of how consistent the subsequent characterization of your findings will be from sample to sample to sample. The unethical thing would be not to inform your audience of what you did and why you did it. If they take issue with your choices, that's one thing. But covering up your choices is quite another.
I can think of an instance where my research group did something that people don't do anymore, but it's called DNA reassociation kinetic curve. And we had a few outlying points that we had reason to believe were due to experimental differences. The way we handled it when it came to the publication was we did the analysis with the outliers in it and without the outliers in it, and put them side by side and said, here's what we see with the outliers, here's what we don't, if the outliers are taken out. The fact of the matter is it actually didn't make any difference to the overall numbers in the thing. And that's what, if you have enough robust data points in your things, outliers shouldn't make a big difference. If an outlier is making a huge amount of difference in your data, you've got to really think about whether that outlier, whether there's really a good justification for keeping that outlier out. Is there something that was just done that was totally different? If not, it should be included.
Any questions from the audience? Okay, next question. How are students protected from harassment by tenure-track faculty whose research productivity determines their prospect for tenure?
Can you say a little bit by what you mean by harassment in that circumstance?
Well, I didn't come up with the question, so.
Okay. Like,
What do you think it means?
What I think it means, from what I would, this is just my brain, I would think it means from a professor who's so concerned for tenure that they push the student to just produce and produce and produce, even if they have no if their dissertation project is not on that subject, to just produce, to have their name on it, so to speak?
Well, I think you use the word harassment, but even on a broader thing, mistreated or treated in a different way, I think it's important that the students have somebody they can talk to, and I don't know that we have this particular mechanism. I was at a meeting last week, and I was talking to somebody from Columbia University, and we were talking about international students and them working, and if they have problems, how do they communicate those problems to people if the rest of the faculty may not speak their particular language, where maybe the professor does or doesn't. And so I don't know that I've never had that situation. I like to have the relationship with the graduate students, so you communicate, but you would hope that within each department, the student would, the graduate programs would have somebody that designated that a student could go talk to if they had a problem. I don't know that we necessarily do. Some schools have ombudsmen for the students that they can go talk to. I think in the University of Florida, all their schools do, and so that might not be something we have here, but perhaps that's something we might want to look into, is some mechanism at the graduate school to talk to. If I was advising a student that had a problem, I would say, well, you go talk to the dean of the graduate school and then let them handle it. That would be the way the mechanism's set up now.
One of the difficulties that in my particular area of research, and by the way, I'm from plant and soil sciences ultimately, I'm a professor in plant and soil sciences, is that unlike, there's advantages and disadvantages of having money. The disadvantage is that if you get a grant and you plan to utilize students to conduct the research in that grant, you're working on a timeline, and so you want to get as much accomplished as possible. Very soon after I came to Mississippi State, I did get funding, and I was originally put students, graduate students, as in part of the in the experimental plan and so on. Over time, I've become much more cautious about doing so, because I think one of the problems that we see is that especially a lot of PhD students ended up coming into labs with an assistant professor who's trying to get things out the door, and they're treated almost, they assume the role more of a technician than of a graduate student. And I think that's part of the reason why so many fields require you to have postdoctoral research. Is becoming more and more common, because a lot of times the folks that are coming out as PhDs are actually more at the level of technicians, because they haven't had that ability to really develop a project on their own and really put the intellectual capital into it. It's already there in place for them. They're essentially technicians. So I've shied away now from, I fund my students off of little projects or little side projects associated with bigger projects. And because I don't think it's fair to them to try to push them into that. And I don't want to train technicians. I mean, unless they want to be technicians, but I'm not looking for the graduate students. But there is, I see it happening.
I would say in general that there's kind of a formal path you should follow and an informal one. There should be some sort of system for dealing with grievances in a department. So it should go to the director of graduate studies or the department head, and then the dean of grad school, something like that formally. I tell students that your success in academia has everything to do with the number of high quality mentors you find. Some of them are going to be official mentors, some of them are going to be unofficial mentors. Having an unofficial mentor is a great person to talk to when you have these types of problems, because they'll know all kinds of ways to deal with things. And so In general, that would be my advice, is that if it's something like sexual harassment, then you have to make the appropriate people who are in charge known. If it's just that you feel exploited because you're not getting to do enough of your own work, say, that's something you have to use your judgment about. But having a mentor is a great resource, I'd say.
Okay. Next question. In a social science research project, what responsibility does the researcher have to the research participants?
Well, the basic rules are pretty straightforward. And in fact, anyone that goes through the certification process here at Mississippi State to either RCR, Responsible Conduct of Research, or Introduction to Research Ethics, whether it's the city training, CITI online, or whether it's a presentation on campus, the basic tenets haven't changed in 50 years. Number one, you want to treat research participants, not subjects, as human beings that are giving their time and their energy to you. They are gifting you, the researcher, not the other way around, and they need to be respected for that choice, and as a result, they also need to be made perfectly clear that it's their option whether to sustain their engagement in a study or not, that they can withdraw at any time. There's no deleterious consequences associated with that. Second, that you do not expose them unnecessarily to anything that would cause risk, whether it's risk of harm in a physical sense, emotional sense, or from loss of anonymity or confidentiality. And then third, the research is going to have some utility to it. It's not just research for the sake of doing something because I was bored this afternoon, but research that would have some fundamental payoff to the discipline or to humanity as a whole later on, or in the case of some kinds of studies, research that could potentially benefit the participant. So those, I think, are the fundamental responsibilities. As I said, they haven't changed in half a century. The fact that some people abuse the privilege, and students sometimes come through the system feeling like every study they participate in, they're going to be lied to because folks have overused deception. That doesn't bode well for creating the next generation of would-be participants, because instead of folks who will be representative of the population, we'll have a representative group of folks who come in doubting and disbelieving what the researcher tells them, and looking askance or askew at the research protocol, and so chances are they'll get a less forthright set of responses.
We also worry about putting an unequal distribution of benefits and burdens on one particular population. So it's good to make sure that your research embraces all different populations and doesn't burden one with benefits that go to some other population. But yeah, I agree with all those things.
Next question. What criteria should be used to determine authorship on a manuscript in preparation for submission for publication?
I've written a paper on this. It's going to vary by person, but I think the best general definition for who should be an author is who made a substantial direct intellectual contribution to that paper or project. So that would be the thing to look for, is the type of contribution you made. It should be an intellectual one. It should be substantial and direct.
I would concur. There's a number of journals now that routinely ask authors to indicate the contribution of each co-author in a multiple authored paper, trying to be as explicit as they possibly can about that, so as to indicate the degree of contribution. And realistically, just from a human interaction perspective, this is something that probably should be negotiated at the front end of the process, rather than after all the work is done and people start getting feisty about, oh, you implied I was going to be lead author, and so forth. That, when it's all said and done, is not the time to be sorting that out.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think it's much easier to avoid problems of authorship attribution from the get-go by agreeing to something and revisiting if things change than it is to try to figure out at the end. Part of the problem is that it's part of human nature. I think we all overvalue our own contributions. And so it's quite hard to figure out who actually should get credit for what. So if you have an agreement ahead of time, that's always the best practice.
It can get very tricky when you've got, for example, we had a paper in 2012 in Nature, and there was, I think, 70-some authors and co-authors on that. And it was a genome sequence of a cotton plant. There was a lot of people involved with it. It was a huge project. And going through and putting the authors on deciding who's going to be an author and who's not going to be an author, and even the order of the authors can become very politically challenging. It can become a pretty nightmarish. But it usually, exactly what these other gentlemen have said here, it helps if there's some sort of understanding up front. As you go along, new people will come in and be involved and contribute in an intellectual way, and they need to be included. And there's always somebody left off. And that's always a difficult thing, is that a lot of times it comes down to whoever's the first author, whoever put the most investment into their time and stuff, that will make those decisions. And but it can be very taxing.
As a graduate student, how do you decipher, should I get credit for this, or this is a part of my job? What would you advise a graduate student as far as that situation? To say, I'm helping you with this project, should my name go on this project, or should this be just associated with my 20 hours per week that I'm supposed to do?
Both. No, so I would say that just because you put work into a project does not mean that your name will necessarily appear on a paper. If your contribution was purely technical, if you've been washing test tubes, that will not get you authorship credit. Now, if that's all you're ever doing in your studentship or as a TA or an RA, whatever it is, you're not being properly mentored. And so one of the jobs, I think as you said, of an advisor is to make sure that their students are doing intellectual work on these projects, and so that you should be included as an author. But I don't think that you have a claim to authorship if you've just done work and it hasn't been intellectual. But I do think that it's good mentoring to allow students to make intellectual contributions.
I would agree, and simply say that a lot of the accreditation agencies that my department deals with look very kindly upon the situation of professors bringing students in on research and engaging them, and that carry over to conference presentations and publications. That says we're taking more interest in working for the professional development of students, as opposed to simply using them up and ignoring their contributions. So it really behooves us from a practical perspective to get them involved and keep them involved, and as you suggest, get them involved at a level that represents a genuine contribution, so that they'll learn what research is about, as opposed to just being kept at bay and made to do something and feel marginalized in the process. That's not helping them grow professionally.
Of course, I agree, and it's part of our responsibility. I mean, that's what the purpose of us being here is, to, as you said, mentor the students and bring them up and teach them that. And the lab that I came out of, that was the process and the custom, and so try to do the same thing. That's why we're here.
Next question. How do you go about training your students to assure their ethical conduct of research?
Well, I guess there's no way to actually assure anything, but one of the things that most of anymore, graduate students that are involved in any projects that are funded federally are required to go through all these training things that you may have already been through some of this. The granting agencies have become have decided this is a very important thing for them to do, to make sure that people, anyone involved in one of the projects that they're funding, goes through very sort of ethics training. And so, yeah, my students all go through the ethics things that are offered here at the university. This is fairly new. I mean, this was typically the old way was you learned it kind of on the job, if you didn't already come pretty well equipped with it. But now there's these seminars, there's classes and other things that they offer here at the university, and you may be required to take them, or if you haven't already. Of course, it doesn't assure ethical behavior, but it just is there to remind you. And I think one of the things that anymore, if you get like the little feeds from various things, science news, there's ethics violations make the headlines all the time. And you'd think that everybody was cheating on this stuff, but whatever it is, it gets amplified because it comes from all around the world and it's suddenly there. But it does make you realize you do not want to be in one of those situations, because I mean, you can do a lot of things as a principal investigator, scientist. You can cheat on your spouse. You can cheat on your taxes. Whatever. I'm not suggesting that you do either of those things, but those things people won't necessarily say that person can no longer practice science, or well, we're not going to trust that person. You cheat on your research, and that becomes out there. Your career is pretty much shot. You don't do that.
There's essentially three opportunities that we have in our neck of the woods for dealing with that. When our students come, before classes start, their first semester, we have an orientation session, and we deal with the ethics questions from that moment on. The second way is by modeling throughout every interaction and every course and every project that we engage the students with. And the third way is that all of our students in that department take a course, and we spend roughly a third of the course addressing research ethics. And there are standalone courses also available at Mississippi State. Philosophy and Religion has one, or maybe it's two different classes that address that same set of topics. So the reality is, I don't think it's fair for students to plead ignorance any longer. And so it's a matter of at least the awareness is there, and you hope that it takes you.
I think agree with them, the modeling is important, as was evidenced by Dr. Peterson's example of how that student saw how his lab act for y'all, the people that are going to be mentors in the future. How you model is very important, and of course this is just a perfect example of that.
Yeah, I agree with all those things. To plug my own class, you can take the Philosophy and Religion course, 8101, Case Studies in Research Ethics. We cover these things, but I agree, actually, the best way to train graduate students is to model behavior, and also to explicitly, briefly at lab meetings, discuss the ethical aspects of certain things that you would take for granted. Just making that part of the way you do research, I think, is the best training. So, and making it explicit as well, not merely modeling, but also kind of explicitly talking about it throughout the course of your day.
Next question. How does a journal assure that ethical conduct of research has been upheld in papers that it publishes?
Well, this is an interesting question. and it's actually quite a hard question. Typically, the use of peer review, sending it to the people in the field that have expertise and having them read it and comment on it and weigh in on whether or not it should be published, has been the way that things have been done. People have tried to come up with other methods. So far, I'm not aware of any that work any better. But it is difficult because I know that personally I get probably 5 to 10 papers sent to me a week of people wanting me to review them. I can't do that. I can maybe do 1 or 2 at most. So that puts it gets hard because there's a lot of people putting out papers, and but one of the things that you need to be aware of also is that journals themselves may be predatory. There are a number of journals out there now, especially on these online journals, that they just take your money, they don't actually send it out for review, and they publish it. And there was a paper, I think it was in Science, where someone essentially came up with a series of sham, or wrote an article that was just nonsense, and submitted it, and to see how many journals would accept it. And a whole lot of them did. And they just asked him to send the money, and and they even had fake reviews and so on, and they discovered that, or they didn't have any reviews at all. So you've also got to look at the journal. There's actually a great website, I don't know the link of it. There's a guy that tracks what he calls predatory journals, and there's certain companies that are more trustworthy than other. But as someone that's getting your research, you want it published in a place that's going to be respected, and that's still going to be there in 2 months as well. And there are journals popping up left and right, and you have to be really careful. And so now there's also that aspect that's kind of a new thing that you have to think about.
The short answer is journals can't assure it. A lot of journals will ask for statements if the research involves human subjects or animal subjects, that appropriate research protocols were followed. A lot of journals will ask authors to issue a statement of any potential conflict of interest, whether it's financial or otherwise. As we mentioned earlier, a lot of journals will address the question of contribution to authorship. And most respectable journals do use peer review, ideally blind peer review, but in some fields the number of active folk are so small that everybody pretty much knows everybody's work anyhow. But the minute you start reading it, you say, oh, yeah, so-and-so's work. But the fact of the matter is peer review cannot identify willful misconduct of research. If someone wants to sit up late at night and invent numbers, I promise you it's not that difficult to do it in a way that nobody can figure out. Now, obvious plagiarism, yes. Gobbledygook, yes, if humans read the stuff. But there's the apocryphal story, and there's still an MIT website up where you type in 4 or 5 things, you and your co-authors' names, and your affiliation, and it will generate a paper with figures, data, results, references. And the young student, at that time, who concocted that program, used it to submit to a conference, and the conference accepted his proposal, and then he wrote back and said, "Oh, you know, of course, that this is gobbledygook, and it was just a computer program," and they hemmed and hawed and said, "Well, of course, we never would have really accepted it if we'd known that," sort of thing. But at the same time, people who are studying behavior of scholarly publications sometimes run into pushback also. 20-some years ago, there was an instance of a manuscript sent to a well-known journal in sociology. The manuscript had, in fact, been previously published. And anyone with 5 seconds of time could have found that. Come to find out that this respected journal, peer-reviewed journal, Nobody caught the fact that it had been previously published, and they were sending, back final revisions to the would-be author, and at that point the author said, "Oh, I got you, didn't I? This really was a real manuscript for publication." At which point then the editor of the publication tried to out this person and get the association, ASA, to disenroll the individual as a member. So it's a tricky thing, but the long and the short of it is, peer review is great for figuring out, are the methods appropriate? Was the research seemingly competently done? Do the results match and support the conclusions that the authors draw? Do they miss any important literature that could have brought to bear in terms of shaping the question or the interpretation? Past that, it's anybody's guess.
I would actually agree with that, and I think part of it is that research is a trust-based enterprise, is that you are trusted as a researcher to not be fraudulent. And so peer review simply is trying to improve the things that could occur with honest error or just not doing things at your best. And so that's why you get in such trouble when you cheat at science, is that you lose that trust that people are going to extend to you to be part of that community. And so integrity is incredibly important to science in general. There's actually a great website. It's not the website you're talking about, although I think it's a librarian in Utah somewhere that has that website. Yeah. There's another website called Retraction Watch, and all it does is keep track of the retraction notices in journal articles. And it's really interesting because they will actually write to journals. If the journal doesn't have a clear description of why an article was retracted, they'll write it and get the real story. And that really is the only thing that journals can do, is try their best to correct when they find out after the fact that fraud has occurred. And the website's quite fascinating. It really is a window into science. The things that people have done to cheat are hilarious and sad, but they really are quite interesting. My favorite was a guy who made up fake reviewers for himself. He made fake emails that all went to himself, and then the paper got sent to those emails to review, and he wrote reviews of his own work and then it published. And so, I mean, the people do all kinds of funny things, but this website captures everything, and I think it actually has had a big impact in terms of thinking about what happens when people do bad things in research, because before no one would know. But now, I mean, it becomes public, and they track serial offenders, and I think it actually is having changing the way we think about people who commit research misconduct. So I think it's quite a good innovation. But that is, I think, one of the few things that journals can do, is publicize bad behavior when they learn of it.
Okay, the next segment are a few case studies. You are a faculty mentor for a graduate student. The student is taking classes in another department that require written essays. He asks you to read his essays before he submits them, and you routinely Google his work to discover that large parts have been lifted verbatim from the web with no quotation marks or citations. How do you handle this situation, and what should the penalty be for this incident?
I'd say plagiarism is probably the most common type of academic dishonesty that most of us encounter. And in some instances, I've had discussions with students and found they just didn't understand very well what plagiarism is. And that's why I think a lot of these ethics classes or courses or stuff to really spell out what plagiarism is are very important, because but you know, it is interesting because, for example, there was an instance where I got a paper to review from some very quite famous people that were the last authors on the paper. And as I started reading that, I thought, that sounds really familiar. And I found a paper where they lifted the text from it. And the question was, how do you handle something like that? Well, I could go, these scientists, the top ones in the field, are lying. They're liars, or they're trying plagiarism. Or you can approach it a little different. What I did is I wrote a review of the article, and I said, I discovered that this region right here of this came from this paper, and this part came from this other paper. And the problem is that this can happen if you've got a big lab like these people did. There might be someone in the lab that just doesn't either understand or is purposely not following the rules. So that doesn't mean everybody involved with a paper necessarily is involved in plagiarism. They just haven't taken the time to check it against everything that they know. So at that point, I wrote a thing to the editor, and I said, I think that the senior authors need to be aware that there's plagiarism here. And it's pretty serious, but I don't want to make it, but at least at that point, the editor knew what was going on. And they ended up talking with the individuals, rewriting the paper, submitting it. It was a good paper. But I have students, when they write essays, I will usually check them to see if they've lifted material. It's so easy to do that nowadays, to check on it. I don't know, how do you have any?
Well, I had a student, international student, and they had written a paper, or we're talking doing some work, and their understanding, like Dr. Peterson said, of what plagiarism was, where they come from, the background they came from. The thing was, they were more or less said it was more a thing of honor to write what somebody had written just verbatim. That showed honor, and so I explained to them that that was not the way to go, and they had not been here that long, and the courses at that time, they didn't have the ethics courses. When we were coming up, we had one source, and it was a written source, and that was it. And now there's, as he said, there's so many ways to get information and bring it in. And there again, how much should be changed or has to be changed. I've found that different fields look at some things different ways, and so that's why it's important to get that student. If I was talking to that student, I would try to understand what their level of knowledge was, and then respond according there, not make it a major ordeal where you throw them out, see what the situation is, and try to respond in order to help them learn that this is not the way to do it and what to be looking for technically next time.
I would say in this case, it's a great teachable moment because it hasn't been submitted yet, and they haven't plagiarized in the sense of submitted somebody else's work for their own credit. And so I think you've caught it in enough time that sitting down with a student, figuring out why this happened and why it can't happen again, and giving them their one pass is perfectly appropriate. So I would not punish a student for that. If it hadn't been yet submitted, that would be the kind of thing that we'd have to talk about it. Explain why you can't do this ever again, and why this will get you in trouble, and leave it at that. Some people just have a block about plagiarism, even if you explain that you can't plagiarize and they understand it, they just can't help themselves. And so hopefully it's not that kind of case, but it's just an honest understanding.
I had an essay turned in this semester from a good student, but anyway, essentially most of the essay was taken verbatim from other things, but it was in quotes. He did cite the source. And I had to have a discussion with him about how that's not particularly good writing. But I mean, you can, he was trying to be honest in that sense, but it sure would be a lot easier if I could just take big chunks of other papers and put them together and just put the quotes in, then I could write a paper pretty
practically
quickly.
writes itself.
Yeah.
One thing that a couple of folks I know use as sort of a proactive mechanism is before a student turns in a paper like that, they require the student to run it through the Turnitin tool. And that helps the students become more sensitive to the things that'll get flagged, and sometimes in ways they wouldn't have anticipated otherwise. So the instructor doesn't have to do it, because the students have already done the pre-screening for them, which I think is a very clever way of sort of getting at two birds with one stone.
I would say that for my undergrads, I explain what plagiarism is, and we even plagiarize a paper in class, and I submit it to turn it in, and I show them what I see, and I still catch plagiarists. And so, I mean, it's not an easy problem to eradicate for some reason.
Any other comments? Next scenario, you have a graduate student that has been working in the lab for a year on what she hopes will be her dissertation research. She has been troubled by the last several months at the possibility that her advisor may be manipulating data to be used in his publications. This past week, she discovered that what she believed to be evidence that his published data was fabricated. What should the student do, and with whom should she discuss this issue?
Well, I will take a first crack at this. There's been a history of throughout history, whistleblowers often end up having a hard time. But in this case, and in cases where this occurs, it's very important for the student to do something. And I think things have gotten a lot better in terms of the way that administration is set up to deal with such issues. My first suggestion would be that this person should go to the department head, because ultimately everything works up the chain, and the next person above the faculty member who you're working with is the department head. Department heads need to take this very seriously, and all of us that have that kind of a position, believe me, it would be very serious. And then it would go up the chain of command to the, and if it doesn't, then you would probably want to go to the next highest level, the dean level probably. But generally, if the department head finds out something about this, if they don't act on it, this could be their job as well as the faculty member's job. We are required to let our bosses know about these things.
I agree with that. Of course, depending on the student, this could be fraught with all kind of potential landmines. If this was an international student, the threat of losing the visa and all those things which are there. If it went the wrong way, you want to report up the chain. But as I said earlier, I think it's incumbent upon the system that we have here, and that they have somewhere they can go and talk and that the students understand that coming in on the front end. If you run into a situation like this, and I don't know if this is in the ethics courses or not that people take, then this is how you would report it. If you have problems, who you can talk to.
I have a question. Is there any scenario where the student would approach the advisor first before taking it up the chain of command?
I would hope so. I mean, I think that it depends on what type of, how blatant and what type of manipulation the student is seeing. I would hope that my grad students would question me if they didn't understand why I was doing something, and say, hey, why did you do this on this? And that would be fantastic. And sometimes they do. It's not usually about ethical things, but sometimes it's about how you do. There may be an explanation. The best way ultimately is if you can communicate, because you may find out that there's more there. But the problem is that I can see is if you have very clear evidence that something's being manipulated, and it's clear that it's a type of of misconduct, not just a different way of looking at the data, you're probably better to go to the department head or the next in line and talk with them and get their advice, and at least they know your side of the story. It doesn't necessarily mean anything's going to break open and change, but it does protect you, or it should protect you.
Yeah, not to liken the question to any other thing, but if you think about the last year, or maybe it was the year before last, my memory's fading, the episode at Notre Dame where the idea of something being reported didn't yield action in a timely way, then obviously it was a problem there, and it would be a problem anywhere. The student in this year's, in your scenario, is walking on eggshells because he or she is vulnerable, and they know that. And their mentor, if that's the person that's being suspected of misconduct, that makes it all the more dicey for them. So there is this concern about their academic future being at risk. And I fully agree with the comment that history has not been kind to whistleblowers by and large. Those folks often end up being tarred with the same brush or investigated themselves first before, say, a rising superstar would be held under the microscope. But MSU has a wide open anonymous portal called the Ethics Point that anyone can register a concern or a complaint in, and I promise you those things get paid attention to in a reasonably prompt way. They tend to get sometimes overblown, in my opinion, at that point, but that's the way we roll nowadays. These are the times we find ourselves in. But if it were possible to deal with the mentor directly, that would be the first step. In fact, the ethical standards of APA would say that's exactly what you do. You go to the person first. But I could well understand the student having a number of concerns about doing that and thinking that they might be putting their academic future at risk by doing so. So, up the ladder, next best thing.
And you are putting your academic future at risk. I mean, as a student, you're in an asymmetrical relationship on a number of fronts. You have less power, you have less knowledge, and so, I mean, you really are in a bad spot. You are counting on your mentor to further your career by writing letters and doing things. And so if you damage that relationship, you are explicitly putting your career at risk. And so it is a horrible spot to be in. If you have explicit knowledge that something is being done unethically, I do think it's best to talk to the person first, because you might just not understand. And I think that's part of why advisors know more than students, is that there are things that you don't understand. But again, you do have an obligation to try to remedy anything that you know is unethical. And I do think that the anonymous ethics portal is a good way to go. Teresa Gamble is the research ethics officer. You can contact her directly. I mean, there are avenues for trying to figure this out. But it's not ever going to be that great for you as a student. That's a sad thing. We had a case recently, not we, but Mark Hauser, a famous Harvard animal ethologist, had a case where his grad students, after discussing this continually with him and without, decided that he was just cheating. And you know, it hurts all their own careers. Here they get this prestigious postdoc in Mark Hauser's Harvard lab, and now Mark Hauser is fired and has no ability to promote people's careers, and they're part of it. So it is damaging. So it's not
great. Next scenario. Jack and Jill are working in a research group doing similar research. Jill comes up with an interesting mathematical model that is applicable to Jack's research. After getting permission from Jill, Jack uses the model in his research. The two students are submitting research papers for publication at almost the same time. Is it the ethical way to acknowledge use of this model in the two journal articles? And what if Jack is ready to submit his manuscript first?
First, last, almost irrelevant. just give credit where credit's due.
Yeah, we don't have a problem with this either. We cite work that's in the manuscript form or forthcoming all the time. And so as long as whoever properly cites the paper that announces that model, it doesn't matter if it's not yet published. That's the way we do things. And so I don't think there's a standard prohibition against that. So.
Anybody else? All right, we have.
It is a difficult question. I think generally what you said is true. I know that in some places they don't, if the model is essentially lies at the heart of Jack's paper, he probably needs to talk more with Jill and possibly I don't know. It depends upon the situation. Jack may want Jill to be co-author on his paper. But then, of course, I don't know. It is, I don't know Jack and Jill personally.
Something about a hill?
I think they were in hydrology, weren't they? Instead of water.
Okay, last scenario. Bert is collaborating with Ernie, and I did not come up with these characters. Bert is collaborating with Ernie on a research paper that will be a chapter in Bert's dissertation. How should Ernie's contribution be acknowledged in Bert's dissertation, and can the work also be featured in Ernie's dissertation?
There's a lot of ways that could play out, depending on what the contribution amounts to and what, how strongly or minor a role it plays in the focus of Ernie's dissertation. But it seems to me that the appropriate group to address this would be the respective program committees, or the major professors directing the dissertation, that they should be made aware of this and address it in the way that seems appropriate for that discipline. On this campus, some departments will let students do as dissertations a series of publications and wrap those together in some overarching discussion, and that's their dissertation. In others, it has to be a standalone project from start to finish. So the discipline would probably impact on that, as well as the degree of impact that particular chapter or portion of a chapter would have. But folks should go into it, I think, having made an agreement from the front end rather than having to deal with the fallout of accusations after the fact.
Yeah, I don't know of any universal rules for how to deal with it. I think it is all kind of a case-by-case basis and field by field. I have seen people with dissertations who have sections of them with co-authors published. So it has happened. It would be very rare in philosophy to do that, but it would not be very rare in other fields. So it just kind of depends on the field. It would be strange, I think, for a committee, well, maybe not, I shouldn't say that, but if two grad students from the same department and they wrote a paper together and they each wanted to be part of their dissertation, I think that would be unusual, but I'm not sure it's unheard of.
I would say probably for the departments that I've served on in graduate committees, which is quite a few of mainly biological science type. Typically, if someone writes a paper and it's been published, and they want to include this in their dissertation, that is actually, it's generally smiled upon, because ultimately publications are better currency than the dissertation, except that you need the dissertation to be the PhD. Typically what I've seen is you might write a paper, if you're the first author on it, and there's 3 other people that are co-authors on it. Generally senior, probably senior people in the lab or or your whatever. Typically, you write the chapter. You don't take the paper verbatim. You can take a lot of it verbatim, but you don't take you don't just glue the paper in there literally. But you're supposed to present everything as work that you have done, and then acknowledge, usually in some sort of acknowledgement section at the end of each chapter or whatever, who else has been involved in that research. In terms of splitting up between Bert and Ernie, again, I think that's fairly rare. Usually the person that is considered the first author who did the most writing and the most work on it will be able to use that in their dissertation. That doesn't mean that that part that Ernie wrote, or that part that was Ernie's contribution, can't be utilized in his dissertation. It just may not be taking the whole publication and putting it in there. But a dissertation has a very distinct format that's different than a publication. And you can, like I say, I prefer that my students write the papers and get them published. And then it's a lot easier to write a dissertation from that than the other way around. But they have to reformat them into a dissertation style.
Well, that's all the questions that I have, and I certainly thank you for your time, because I learned a lot. I definitely learned a lot. Like I said before, coming from plant and soil sciences with my master's over to the School of Human Sciences, you have to take into a larger account of what's going on and the things you have to pay attention to. So it's, for me personally, it's always good to have these type of discussions. So, and I thank you for your time in participating.
Thank you very much. Thank you. We really appreciate it.
Questions?
You've heard everything.
Thank you for doing this.
Been saturation bombing.